world. It all goes back to the end of chapter 1. The more you know, the more it hurts, right? He's saying, hey, those who haven't been born don't know anything, so they don't have any hurt. It's a hopeless sort of a thing to live like this. And Solomon feels that and expresses that. Verse 4, again I saw for all the toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hand and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Many people work to keep up with the Joneses, to have the stuff that their neighbors have, or they are encouraged by their children to give them the things that the kids at school have. This is vanity and vexation of spirit, Solomon says. This is no motivation for life. A fool knows what he may have, but he won't bother because he'd rather sit around. A wise man is content with enough and is not obsessed with the vanity of striving for what is unnecessary in his life. Verse 7, then I turned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother. There is no end to all of his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. If they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. And again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. How can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Solomon, I think, is developing from his previous comments. Did I skip a passage? I did. No, I didn't. Okay, we're good. I'm running ahead of my notes a little bit here. In the first little chunk here in verses 4 through 6, there's this idea that we toil and labor to get the stuff that we want. And he's actually said 3 times so far that within certain contexts, this is all right? He said that 3 times so far because he's told us, enjoy your labor, have a good time, enjoy your fun, enjoy your food. So in some contexts, what he has described in verses 4 through 6 is just fine, but in the context which follows, verses 7 through 8, this is a vain way to pursue this. All right? The fool doesn't pursue it at all. The wise man understands and balances his life. But then there's this greedy man in verses 7 and 8 who works and works and works and hoards and saves. He's the classic miser, right? The Scrooge who has everything and actually spends nothing on anyone and has no one to leave it to. There's nothing for him except the accumulation of things, which will result in the enjoyment of absolutely nothing at all. This is what is being described here, and it's a tragedy. It's a vanity under the sun. But Solomon observed this. He saw this among many people, and it frustrated him. I wonder if he saw it in himself sometimes. So he goes on to say in verses 9 through 12 that we were made for companionship. If we set ourselves off and apart and just go it alone, then we are setting ourselves up for vanity and frustration. Instead, 2 are better than 1, because then you have safety and encouragement, warmth, and strength. This is what we have in companionship. 13 through 16, better a poor wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with that second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely also this is vanity and grasping after the wind. So track with me through Solomon so far. He looks like he's giving us snapshots of different things, right? It feels like he's moving from topic to topic to topic, but it looks to me like there are connections between these things. he is flowing from one idea to another to get to a particular conclusion. So chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, the helpless often suffer, and it looks very unjust. We often pursue our own ends in a vain and empty way, verses 4 through 6. And there is this man who is a miser who does nothing good. All he does is accumulate. God has made us not to be like that. God has made us for companionship. We are to be among people who can bless, encourage, and support us while we ourselves are doing blessing, encouragement, and supporting. This is what he has made us for. And then verses 13 through 16, he describes someone who started poor and then was raised up to be king. And he was a benevolent king. He was a good king, and he encouraged and blessed his people, like was described in verses 9 through 12. He was a good leader. I don't know if Solomon was describing David or describing a likeness to David. I'm not sure. But what he's got here is this example of a selfless, humble leader who was vilified and quickly taken for granted. He was forgotten, and all the benefits that he brought his people were counted as nothing. Those who came after him will not rejoice in him, it says there in verse 16. And he sees this as a great vanity and frustrating thing. And I think he's reflecting on his father and himself and thinking, look at all the good that we have done in this nation as we have followed God, as we have tried to serve him. And he has come to the conclusion that all of that is going to go away in a couple of generations. He is certain that all that was gained will eventually and very soon be lost. And he is so frustrated by that. So I see here in chapter 4 Solomon's reflection on a number of different things. But I think it comes to a point there at the end of the chapter when he reflects on the king who has done so much for his people. And it didn't last. Even that good, great thing that was done by a good, great, and humble man ended up in vanity and frustration. Now I think he does change subjects in chapter 5. He says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God. When you draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Do not be rash with your mouth. Do not let your heart utter anything hastily before God, for God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and in many words there is vanity. And the but there is instead. That's the idea there. But instead, fear God. Focus your heart on something else. How you behave yourself in the place of the presence of God is of great significance. And it's kind of different from imagine Solomon entering the temple that he and his father planned and that he built, okay? And he built it as an act of worship, as his father wanted to do. It was something that was passed on from father to son, and he built it as an operation of worship. And he put years and the equivalent of millions and millions of dollars in today's money into building that temple, so that there would be a place where God was no longer living in a tent, but he had a permanent dwelling place among the people of Israel. That's what he wanted to do with this temple, what his father wanted him to do with this temple, and he did it. And then he goes into the temple as king and he worships. And he participates in the worship that is going on there. And he's in the outer courts, he's in the middle courts, he's in the inner courts, and he's doing all of these different things involved in worship. And while he's there, he's witnessing other people also involved in worship. And he sees this sort of thing going on. He sees people coming to the temple and being showy and bombastic and making big, huge vows before God, so everyone will say, ooh, wow, look at that. They must be really set apart to God. They must be really holy. It actually makes me think of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts. You guys remember them, right? They saw Barnabas sell off his beachfront property in the island of Cyprus and give all the money to the church. And so they said, we're going to do the same thing because we want a nickname too. Because after Barnabas did that, he was given the name Barnabas. What was his name before then? He had a name before then. They called him Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, because he dumped so much money into the early church. Is it Thomas? Oh, now I'm going to have to look that up, but not now. All right, so Ananias and Sapphira said, we want a nickname too. It's so cool to have a nickname in the early church. Barnabas is called son of encouragement. If we do something, I wonder what nickname we'll get. Now, I'm making fun of them a little bit. Maybe they didn't think that, but what they did do is they did sort of copy Barnabas. So they took some property that they had and they sold it, and they kept back some of the money, which was entirely their right. They could do that if they wanted to. But then they went and offered the money that they planned to use for the sale of that property as if it was the whole thing. And they made sure everyone knew. They showed off. God, look at this that we're giving to you, just like Barnabas. What's my nickname? You know, that's what they were doing. And God killed them both. He didn't have someone else do it. He killed them. He said, you're dead, and they were. Solomon saw things like this happening in the temple, and then he saw what followed it when people did not follow through on their oaths. And so he gives advice here in chapter 5 and says, when you go to the house of God, and he's not talking about church as we think of church. He's talking about going to the temple and being involved in the major and important rituals of Judaism, of the Mosaic Law, of the gravity and the majesty and the horror of blood spilt for sin committed, and then that blood, that life given, being a propitiation for that sin within the law, looking forward to the propitiation of Christ on the cross, and using that to show off. He says, when you go to the house of God, don't be doing that. If you've got business before God, do your business with God. Offer the sacrifice, but don't be shooting your mouth off. Don't be making grandiose vows so that everyone else can hear and see what you're doing. God's hearing and seeing. You are in His house, and He is observing from heaven what you are saying and doing, and He will hold you accountable. So when you go to that time in that place of worship, don't be showing off. Let your words be few. After all, in verse 3, and verses like this scare me all the time. They just do. In verse 3, he says, a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. So often, the person who is the fool doesn't realize it because they won't shut up long enough to find out. And I know that's strong language for some of you, so sorry. They won't be quiet long enough to find out. And I look in the mirror of God's Word, in the character of my life, and I'm afraid that that's me. And so we are called here by Solomon, especially when we are involved in worship, when we are in the place and time when we are declaring together God's worth. Not through the sacrificial system, but through an appreciation of what God has done for us. Maybe the best example of this is when we're observing the Lord's table. But anytime when we are worshiping together at church, we need to be careful, because this is one of the most grave, valuable, and important things that we are called to do by God. So do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. Instead, at the end of verse 7, fear God. 8 through 17. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for high officials watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. He who loves abundance with increase, this also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches kept for their owner to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there's nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked he shall return to go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. This also is a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go, and what profit has he who has labored so for the wind? All his days also he eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Wealth and poverty each carry their own dangers and frustrations. Even the most greedy ultimately work toward their own destruction, and in the meantime are racked by worry. Solomon had it there by saying the more property you have, the more people you have to employ to keep that property up. The more people you have to employ, the more you have to feed them and clothe them and pay them, which means that you have to get more property so that you can find more money to feed and clothe your employees and to gather more wealth to yourself. But when you get more property, guess what? You need more people to run that property. And I think this is something that Solomon experienced himself. The Bible says when the people of Israel were talking to Rehoboam about how he was going to be a king, if he was going to be a king like his father, or if he was going to let up on them a little bit, the Bible tells us that the people of Israel truly felt oppressed underneath Solomon in some ways. They appreciated his wisdom and the prosperity of his reign, but he levied heavily in goods and in servants from all the tribes of Israel. And they felt like, wow, I only have half my family here most of the time, because my son's off in the army, or he's off cutting blocks in this valley over here so the temple can be built, and my daughters are off as servants in this palace or in that palace. You know, spring, summer, winter, fall, wherever the king wants to be, he needs servants. And wherever the king isn't, there need to be servants to keep the palace clean. My daughters are off there half the year, and boy, we need a break from all this wealthy king thing. It's just frustrating for us. Rehoboam, could you let up a little bit? That's basically the story that led to the split of the nation of Israel from Judah. So Solomon, I think he experienced this. I think he's writing from personal experience. He says, man, I tried to find a way to make it all work. And the more I gathered and the more excellent things I built, the more people I had to hire to build them and to keep them up. It just, the wealthy man's life is not all that great. It's full of frustration, because even when I thought I had it all buttoned up nice and good, I'd go to bed that night and I'd be laying there and thinking, oh no, I forgot to do this, and I forgot to do that, and I forgot to do this, and I was just laying there worrying, and I didn't get any sleep, and then I got up the next day with 5 hours of sleep, and I was grumpy, and I can't live like this. It's so frustrating. The poor man, on the other hand, Solomon's walking by this guy all the time. I don't know if he was the sort who shook his hand and said thank you, but whoever this guy is, Solomon's walking by him all the time, knocking on that block, serving food at his table, doing whatever it is that Solomon's making him do. And Solomon thinks, man, that guy, he's got such a simple life. His boss tells him what to do. He does it all day long. He has 3 square meals. He goes to bed, and he sleeps. I don't get to sleep. I worry. He's got nothing to worry about. He sleeps. I think I'd like to trade places with him. Well, no, I guess I wouldn't, because I don't want to give up all this stuff. But still, he feels this tension. This is a great vanity, Solomon says. And then to top it all off, he says, I've seen so many guys like this, guys like me who accumulated wealth and possessions and all this excellence, and then they lost it all. And their son came after them, and there was nothing that they could leave to him. This is a great vanity, to work, and to work with excellence and wisdom all your life long, and then to have a tornado come and take it, or to have raiders come and take it, or to have an earthquake come and knock down your house. Describing Job, right? God is sovereign over our times. He is the one who decides when we are going to mourn, when we are going to laugh. And Solomon is frustrated that he did not have control, and that he saw that control lost by so many others. 18 through 20. Here's what I have seen. It is good and fitting. By the way, this is number 4, preview number 4. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life which God gives him, for this is his heritage. For to every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage, to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. So Solomon here has, in his essay, been dwelling unduly on the days of his life. Did you hear that there in that last verse? When a man dwells unduly on the days of his life, he's going to end up frustrated because he's going to see all the frustration, the vanity and the vexation of spirit. He's going to see what I have seen. So it's better just to enjoy your life, enjoy your work, and don't think about this stuff. And he's like, well, why did you write the essay then? Because he wants us to read the essay and say, okay, Solomon, you did that thinking. I'm just going to enjoy life in the fear of the Lord. So he's saying, I've done this work. Please just take my word for it. I spent my life full of frustration, even though I had everything. I had everything a man could desire, in good and bad. I had all the servants that could be imagined, all the pleasures that could be imagined. I had anything you could imagine, and I still felt frustrated with my life. The more you know, the more it hurts. So instead, just enjoy your life. Enjoy your life. Chapter 6. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun that is common among men, a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires, yet God does not give him the power to eat it, for a foreigner consumes it. This also is vanity and a great evil affliction. If a man begets 100 children, and lives many years, so that the days of his life are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than he. For if it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness, though it has not seen the sun nor known anything, it is yet more rest than that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to one place? So here's what Solomon's doing. He's just made a case for the emptiness and the vanity of riches. And his thought is, well, someone's going to say, no, I don't believe you. I bet if I had all of your pleasure and all of your riches, I would be content. If I won the lottery, how many of you have played? You don't have to raise your hand, but I think all of us have probably played that game in our mind, right? If I won the lottery and had $40 million to spend, what would I do with it? Well, first of all, the government would take more than half of it. So if I won the lottery and had $18 million to spend, what would I do with it? Well, don't start imagining that now. Listen instead, okay? Because that's a fun little game to play. But Solomon here is saying, even if that happened to you, I promise you, it would still end in emptiness and wind chasing. And he uses this example of this guy. He says, what if there was a guy who lived 1,000 years? He lived 1,000 years and he had hundreds of children. And he had all the wealth in the world. And he was able to leave all of his children with a great deal of wealth. And everything went right for him in his life and everything was perfect. He still only has emptiness and frustration. Because if he does not live with God as that puzzle piece in the middle of his life and everything else plugs into it in the right way, in the right place, then he is living under the sun. And there's only one thing under the sun, and that is death. That is death. Do not all go to one place. Chapter 6, the end of verse 6. This is all that we have. Even the best and most imaginable blessings, more than realistic, if God does not will him as being sovereign over his times to enjoy those things, then he won't. God is the one who decides it if it is a time to enjoy or a time to feel vanity. He's the one who decides it. So if God doesn't give it, then it's not to be had. And Solomon says this is a great vanity. I don't want to submit to this, that I don't get to decide my times. Under the sun, this makes me angry. This makes me bitter. This makes me mad. 7, chapter 6, verse 7. All the labor of man is for his mouth, yet his soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise than the fool? What does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Whatever one is, he has already been named. For it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man better? For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life with which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? So man's desires, man's achievements, man feels the need to fill a hole, but he's never ultimately satisfied. Verse 7. Therefore, wisdom and foolishness, wealth and poverty are comparatively immaterial. Desires grow and change. God is the one that is eternal, and we have to come to terms with him. He is sovereign over our times. Man's desires don't expand him, they limit him. Life is short. And I think that we sense that the most significant of our times actually come after this life. Chapter 7, verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death and the day of birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for it is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, the heart of the fools in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. When we choose to come to terms with the tragedy in our lives, with the loss in our lives, then we will benefit in wisdom. If, however, we avoid those times, if we run from them, if we choose to not learn from them, but to drown them with entertainment, with drugs, with alcohol, with whatever else it is that we want to medicate ourselves, then all we've got is nettles under kettles. All we've got is crackle, no heat, nothing real. God is the ultimate reality, and he needs to be the center of the equation of our lives. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases his heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you will not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Righteousness and wickedness do not always mean proportionate prosperity or suffering in this life. A righteous person isn't always the most prosperous. The wicked person doesn't always suffer the most. But, practically speaking, if we live according to God's word, we will often, most of the time, have a quiet, peaceful, and profitable life. And if what we do is we fly in the face of God's commandments, and we try to go our own way, and we care nothing for the lives of others, then it's likely that we will run into God's controls and suffer for it. This is how things usually work. Solomon has a really important warning for us there. He says, don't be quick to long for the good old days. Don't be quick to anger, he also says, in the same context. Live in the place that God has put you, and try to respond the way that he wants you to respond. Seek wisdom. For careful, wise choices are like a well-padded bank account. They set you up for success, and they give you a buffer in times of difficulty. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. Surely God has appointed one as well as the other, so that man cannot find out anything that will come after him. God is the one who decides. We need to enjoy his sovereignty. Sometimes when he wills that our time be full of trouble and sorrow, then we endure his sovereignty. We try to have joy, as Paul commands us, rejoice evermore, in everything give thanks. But sometimes all that we can do is endure and say, God, you're willing this. You're making this my time right now. Please help. God is the one who is in control of our times, verses 13 and 14. 15, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a man who perishes in his righteousness. There is a man who is wicked, who prolongs his life in wickedness. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked or foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, also not to remove your hand from the other. For he who fears God will escape them all. When he says do not be overly righteous, I just want to remind us that he's talking about do not be overly religious. Do not put all of your time and effort into the law of Moses. He's saying, don't be obsessed with, don't be a Pharisee. I know Pharisees weren't around here. But what he's saying essentially is, don't be obsessed with religion. Instead, fear God. And then your religion will fall into place in that puzzle as long as God is in the middle. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers a city. For there is not a just man on the earth who does good and does not sin. Also, do not take to heart everything that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that you have cursed others. Solomon's in this chapter giving us little snippets of good advice. He's kind of stopped writing an essay almost. I mean, this is still his essay, but do you hear the good advice here? How many times have you grumbled in your heart about someone? A boss, a coworker, a brother, a sister, a spouse, a neighbor? How many times have you grumbled in your heart and then it spilled out to your friend, to your wife, to your other coworker? We regret that, I hope, pretty quickly. Sometimes God makes us regret it with embarrassment because it gets all the way out, which is what Solomon is saying here. So when you hear someone else do that to you, just let it pass. Don't store it up and be offended. Just let it pass. All this I have proved by wisdom. Verse 23, I said, I will be wise, and it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, how can I find it? Solomon is just looking at his life and saying, boy, I don't think I've got it. Here I am writing this essay saying I've got it, but when I'm living under the sun, I don't understand how all of this fits together. I applied my heart to know, to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know wickedness from folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death is this, that a woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters, he who pleases God will escape from her, but the sinner will be trapped by her. Here is what I have found, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among these all I have not found. Truly this only I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So here we are again on shaky ground, right? We were here a few months ago. What in the world is Solomon saying here? Well, you got to remember that this guy had 300 wives and 600 concubines. He was not setting himself up for success with obeying God as far as his attitude toward women are concerned.